Okay, so without further ado, let's begin with this workshop. All right, so the first part with reporting research really follows a very standard way. So this standard way, we call them primary research articles, where basically a research team focuses on some very specific research questions and performs this experiment, gathers results, and then writes up the results in English or understandable paragraphs. So to start this kind of article, the researcher would ask some really broad questions to get a sense of what the project is going towards. So for example, this researcher is interested in learning how is the brain structure altered in obesity? And as you can probably see, this question is very vague and broad. This is almost like saying, what is the biology behind obesity? So because this question is very broad, there can be different ways of studying this, and there can also be different perspectives. And to make this research project meaningful, we need to really narrow down our scope to a really answerable question. So to narrow down the scope, the researcher may ask, specifically, how is the axonal integrity in the white matter different in obese people? And we see that this question really has narrowed down the scope in comparison to this broad directional question. Because first of all, we're only looking at white matter, which is a part of the brain, and on top of which we're only looking at the axonal integrity, so the myelin sheath. And so this question really is something that we can answer with one experiment. And after we've really understood what our question is, we need to attempt to answer that using experimentation. So in this case, we're looking at neuroimaging, and in this case, DTI, diffusion tensor imaging. And we see that the brain regions that are red, they appear to have some high level of axonal integrity in comparison to the brain regions that are yellow and green. And once we perform this experiment, we will gather some results or data points. So from the data point, it looks like there is a difference between people that are obese and that are non-obese. There is certainly a difference in the axonal integrity. However, this kind of result is only raw data. So for example, just based on my experiment, I can get some numbers such as, well, the axonal integrity for people with obesity may be 0.05. And for people without obesity, it might be 0.09. So in this case, what we really have are just two numbers, 0.05 and 0.09. But if I relay those numbers to people who are not familiar with the project or not familiar with neuroscience at all, it will be really difficult to make sense out of it. So what people would need to do is to find a way to summarize and present all of those results and the ways the research team has arrived at those results, so the experimental procedure, as well as the initial questions into literature, into writing. And for primary research articles, there is a very structured way of presenting your findings. We will follow what is called the introduction to the conclusion. And in the body of the text, we will document our methods, our key findings, and several discussion or interpretation of our results. There can also be other ways of presenting your research, such as going to a conference and presenting to a live audience, or you can basically engage in conversations with other researchers via coffee chats and such. But for the sake of this presentation, we'll be talking majorly about writing. And to really blow up this structure of writing, we follow this 6 components in the research articles. We'll usually start with an abstract. So the abstract will be a nice 200 to 250 words summary about the key areas in all these components. So there can be, just 1 or 2 sentences on the research question, several sentences about how the experiment was performed, a summary of the key findings, and basically 1 or 2 sentences about, what this finding really tells the general public. So the abstract, because it is such a concise summary, it is something that the researchers or other readers will firstly read upon seeing a scientific article. However, if a person is interested in learning about a specific, he or she will need to read the entire text. And this text is broken down into 4 major components. But we'll start with the introduction. So in the introduction part, the researcher will need to first describe the current set of research. So so if we're following the example with obesity and brain structure, we can say, well, researchers have already looked at rodent models. So in mice, we see that there is some brain structure change with obese mice. And we wonder if that kind of finding can be replicated in humans. So we've identified the mystery. What is the question that is yet to be answered? And after we have this question, what is common to do is to do some sort of prediction of results. So we can predict that, we will say the axonal integrity in people with obesity is lower than that of normal healthy controls. This kind of prediction is technically called a hypothesis, where you make some sort of expectation of your findings. After you've determined your research question, you will need to find ways to explore this question and arrive at your answers. And this overall procedure can be documented within the methods section, where first of all, we will talk about the participant information. This is something really common with human research. So you would talk about what is the age distribution, what is the gender makeup, what is the racial distribution of all of your participants. You will then go on to talk about the experimental procedure, how you basically obtained neuroimaging scans, how you analyze them, and such. And you will end up with statistics. So basically, what kind of statistical analysis methods would you apply to clean up and find patterns within your data? Is it going to be ANOVA? Is it going to be t-test? You need to first identify your methods. And after you have a clear layout about how you reached your findings, you need to describe your data and produce any figures in the results section. By figures, I mean you can have little scatter plots, you can have correlations, you can have bar graphs, pie charts, or basically any visualization of your data. And this data is normally raw data. So by raw data, I mean something that is directly obtained through your methods. So with the example of obesity and axonal integrity, remember we had the 2 numbers, 0.05 and 0.09. These 2 are called raw data, and they will be presented in the results section. However, just as we talked that those numbers independently does not mean anything, we need to put them into context. And this sort of interpretation of results is performed within the discussion section. So because we have 0.05 and 0.09, we can say that the axonal integrity in our research sample is observed to be lower in people with obesity. And this is our interpretation. What we'll then continue to do is to compare our finding and connect them to existing research. We'll say, oh, we're not really surprised by our finding because it is consistent with what is known, for example, in mice. In mice, we see some sort of brain damage for obese mice. And this really confirmed our hypothesis that this finding can be replicated in humans. So you're making some sort of direct comparison between your results to other people's to really assess is there any incongruity, or are you looking at a high level of consistency? Okay, and any type of research will have advantages and limitations. By advantage, I mean how can your research project advance the entire field? So if we're looking at the example of obesity in people, we can say, well, our findings are the first report in human cohorts. Our research is the first performed in real alive people. And you can also address several limitations as to your research project. One limitation, for example, with neuroimaging is that everything is based on some sort of photograph, right? You cannot really, take a person's brain out. You cannot really tangibly touch or see the little biological tissues on the brain. So everything you do, you're super reliant on some sort of photography. And this can be some sort of limitation. We need confirmation from other biological approaches. And this limitation is usually paired with the process of raising questions. What is yet to be answered by your project? Does your project yield interesting results that will require more exploration? So if you have some novel findings, you would want other people to investigate it. You would want other people to really explain that. And in raising those questions, what you're essentially doing is that you're throwing yourself into some sort of scientific conversation. You're asking other people and you're inspiring them to continue your work. And this is especially important in the field of science, that other people are building upon existing research. And they're also identifying new questions so the entire field of science can advance forward. You would end off your report by conclusion. Basically, this is a summary of your key findings and some interpretations. But overall, these 6 components will make up almost any primary research article. Are there any questions as to these 6 components and what they individually mean? Okay, we also have a Q&A section at the very end of this presentation. So you can also hold up your questions to the very end. Okay, now that we've talked about primary research articles, another type of research is called systematic review. And its definition is that it is a combination of empirical evidence that fits pre-specified eligibility criteria to answer a specific research question. What does this mean? Well, basically, in a single research article, you're looking at a piece of information that is kind of distant from others. So one hypothetical example we have here can be, we're looking at 3 individual papers. The first paper talks about, so we found that A and B are observed in disease X. Another paper is talking about B and C are changing in disease X patients. And the third paper talks about, we found that D can modulate the levels of A and C. Now, if you only look at it, these papers individually, you're only looking at a very small portion of the entire disease mechanism. And what the systematic review is trying to do is that it's trying to glue these 3 papers together. So they're all telling some part of a greater picture of the whole story. So the systematic review, based on the findings of these 3 papers, would say, so there is evidence for an A, B, C, D pathway in X. And the evidence are provided through the individual research done in these papers. So systematic review is really not a process where you do new experiments, but this is a way of integration. You're combining other people's results to, to really inform the bigger picture. Another, a subset within the systematic review is called a meta-analysis, and this is a statistical method. So basically, meta-analysis means analysis of analysis. And how this is performed? Well, you will have each individual study as one single subject. So each study will contribute some numbers or results. And those numbers, they will have a value, but they will also have some error or uncertainty. So, the reason behind that is that it is simply insufficient for a given paper to achieve perfect confidence in the entire matter. There will also be some sort of experimental error and simply, uncertainty in the results. However, if we combine all of the data points from every study and we have some sort of pooled estimate, that estimate will be far closer to the unknown common truth. Because by combining all those studies, you're reducing your uncertainty, you're reducing the error. So meta-analysis is a way to group the research findings all together to produce a more accurate interpretation. And this technique is also useful for sometimes spotting falsified results. So for example, if you have 100 research paper and you're doing some sort of meta-analysis, and one out of those 100 papers contains just made up results, it is more likely for that paper's results to deviate or stand alone against all other papers. And because that paper looks like an outlier, you will start to question, did something go wrong in that paper? Or simply was that, should I believe in the results of that paper? So meta-analysis has been used to spot any fraud in science. Are there any questions with systematic review and what it means to do it? All right, so there are several other types of reporting research. And one, in addition to primary research articles and systematic reviews, is called a letter. So the letters can be addressed to the editor of the journal or the researchers. So an example we see here is that on the top, you have a primary research article that is presenting that we found the female brain on average appears to be younger in terms of metabolism in comparison to the male brain. And this is some really interesting findings. This is basically saying the female brain is more probably advanced in terms of metabolism. It is younger and such. However, other researchers, as they're reading through this paper, they may start to raise some questions. They may say, are there any problems with how you selected your sample? There may be other ways to understand your results in addition to saying that the female brain is younger. There may be some sort of confounding variable, or there may be something you just didn't think about when you're doing your research project. And one way to raise all of those comments and concerns is through writing a letter to the research team and to publish that letter as part, as an addition to this paper in the journal. So basically here we have an example of the letter. This letter is asking, when does the youthfulness of the female brain emerge? And by asking this question, they're making the original research team to better scrutinize and understand their results. And this is also a way to promote scientific transparency and to include more people and more perspectives as to how we can answer our findings. So letters are incredibly important to raise comments and concerns in the scientific field. There are other types of research publications, such as editorials. So what are some concerns that the editors are having, and what are the trends in the given present field? There can also be book chapters and encyclopedia entries. However, these are normally not directly reflective of research, but they're more like an accumulation of knowledge and just something you would see on Wikipedia. Are there any questions with how research can be published? Okay, so if there are not, we will go on to peer review. So we're now gonna do something that is fun, and we'll look at some really ridiculous examples. But first, I want to talk about what peer review really is. So after a research team has performed the experiment and they've got some really interesting findings and they've written everything up in the form of a paper or a research article, they will then submit that paper for publication. And after a paper has been submitted, other researchers called reviewers, so these are the people with expertise and understanding in this field, so they're the experts, they will read and critique the paper. So basically, they will look at how the research team has tackled their research question. Is the method appropriate? Is the statistical analysis appropriate? What are the results? Are the results credible? Is the way the research team try to interpret the results meaningful and correct? So all of those things will be passed on to the reviewers who will basically break down this paper and analyze it very, very carefully. This is a process, peer review, to determine, for example, if the results and conclusions are justifiable. That is, the researchers are not just jumping to conclusions. They will also assess the weakness. So for example, you may have a really small sample, and that will be your weakness because we generally prefer larger samples to make a more solid statement. Reviewers are also great sources for offering ways of improvement. So sometimes they will say, there can be better ways of analyzing results. Sometimes they will say, I would prefer that you write everything in another format or something like that. And one of the really signature importance of peer review is that those reviewers, they have the authority to recommend to the publisher whether a paper is worthy of publication. And this is really, really, a intrinsically essential topic in science. For a lot of really famous journals such as Nature and Science, they have a really low acceptance rate. I think currently the numbers are looking at, and it's more difficult on average to publish in Nature in comparison of getting into Harvard. So this is also, a place where peer review really shines. They're trying to really maintain the quality of the journal. They're only trying to make good research to pass through. So the goal is to really ensure good quality of scientific work. And and what can happen if there are no peer review mechanisms? Well, then the researchers can just make really ridiculous statements. So these are just made up examples. But first, we can say, okay, so we demonstrate that with a sample of 99 women and only 1 man, that on average, women have superior verbal intelligence. And apparently, this is just simply an incredibly bad sample. You're having only 1 man. What if that man, just by chance, is having a really, really low verbal intelligence, even comparing to the mean of all male populations? Right? So this is something that peer review will be able to prevent. Another case would be, so, well, I have really designed this new drug and I'm testing how safe this drug is. And what I do is that I apply this drug to some sort of bacteria A, which survived, so that's great. And I want to say, oh, because bacteria A survived, humans can too. And this is an incredible overgeneralization of your findings. You're saying something that your results are not really saying. This is also something that will be prevented by peer review. And lastly, in science, there is something called basically really weird or suspicious correlations. So if we only look at this picture, the red curve is telling you the occurrence of drowning in swimming pools. The blue curve is telling you the appearance of Nicolas Cage in films. And we see that there is considerable overlap of these two curves. So we can almost make the statement that the more Nicolas Cage appears in films, the more people will drown by falling into swimming pools. And simply by looking at this sentence, you will see it is incredibly ridiculous. So this is a way of just hunting for correlations and making nonsensical conclusions. All of these cases will be fairly easily prevented if we have some sort of peer review mechanism where other people can check on your assertions and check on how you've interpreted your results. However, this is not to say that peer review does not have any problems. Unfortunately, for certain journals, their peer review mechanisms are flawed, and sometimes those flaws are too significant that certain research papers, even though they're of really, really poor quality, can pass through and get published. There is one very notorious example with COVID-19. So this paper was recently published, and fortunately, it is now withdrawn. So don't believe anything that this paper says. But basically, this paper says that we show that 5G, so cell phone signals, those signals can be absorbed by dermatologic cells or skin cells acting like antennas and transfer to other cells and yada, 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 and produce coronaviruses in biological cells. So basically, the researchers are saying that cell phone signals are a trigger for some sort of mysterious production of COVID-19 within the human body. And this is simply an absurd claim. And it is still very, very surprising to me that this paper was able to pass through peer review. And this is such a pillar example as to how peer review can be flawed sometimes. Another ridiculous part of this paper is that basically they're saying that 5G signals are really, really detrimental to human health. Cancer is only one of the problems because 5G can cause 720 factorial different diseases. And if you're just looking at it, you think, wow, that is a lot of diseases. But if you do some sort of calculation, 720 factorial is actually 2.6 times 10 to the 1700th power. And that is way larger than the number of atoms in the entire universe. And there simply cannot be that many diseases. So some sort of nonsensical paper was able to pass through the process of peer review and eventually get published. This is a huge alert as to we need to be more careful with the review mechanism. There needs to be more stringent following to critiquing a paper. And another problem with peer review is less obvious. This is something called gender bias. So the peer review process may unfortunately suffer from sort of implicit bias. Even though this bias is not intentional, it is still existing and it is called implicit. So people are not really aware of it when they're performing this kind of bias. So overall, research has found that papers with female first authors obtained on average slightly worse peer review scores and were more likely to be rejected. So basically, if we're just looking at this figure, the green lines are males, the red dots and lines are females. And we see that in all these roles, whether editors, reviewers, or authors, there are more males than females. And this is some sort of gender inequality or gender bias. And this problem has been quite prevailing in the scientific world. In addition to publishing articles, there is also this gender bias in receiving research funding and basically grants to power your projects. So men have been shown to have higher chance of receiving grants than women. So this kind of unfortunately bias, luckily it can be fairly mitigated through certain solutions. One of the solutions is to do some sort of blinding on the name of the authors so that a reviewer would not be able to tell if the authors are male or female. So I just want to push this issue and really try to raise awareness that there can be biases in the scientific world as well. Okay, so peer review has another problem, but it's some sort of intrinsic part of it, is that peer review can be sort of time consuming. It may take several weeks or even months to get the initial feedback from the reviewers. So in certain situations, a researcher may be more prone to publish their results in through other channels. And one of those channels would be called preprints. So preprints are scholarly papers that are publicly available before peer review. So there are two major depositories for preprints. One of them is called PsyArXiv, that's for psychology papers, and bioRxiv, that's for biology papers. And all the papers that are available in these two depositories, they're not peer reviewed. However, this is not to say that those papers do not bear any scientific merit. A lot of those papers are still really legitimate research. It is just simply the researchers will like to gather a lot of feedback quickly, or if there's some sort of public health urgency, such as COVID-19, where we're seeing a lot of case reports and different results flying in almost on a daily basis, and the traditional peer review process, because it can be so long, it will delay the entire process. So preprints can be especially helpful during some sort of public health crisis where results needs to be communicated effectively and very, very quickly. Many of the papers in these two depositories will eventually go through the peer review process and get published. Another type of publication is called open access. So back in the very ancient days where people still go to the physical library, what the libraries would do is that they would subscribe paper versions of the journals. So you will be able to read the research articles on paper, and that those kind of obtainment of research articles is through subscription. In the modern electronic era, subscription is still existing. Sometimes if you go and look for a paper, you will be asked for roughly $30 to $60. So there is a lot of argument and push for open access. Open access journals are also peer reviewed. However, their articles do not require any sort of payment. Any person will be able to read their articles. And this kind of publication has recently seen a lot of popularity because there's this firm belief that because science is, is produced by people, and because science can yield beneficial results and understanding for the entire human race, that science simply should be accessible to every person. So just keep in mind that there can be alternative ways for publication. Preprints are without peer review, but it's really fast. And it's really easy to gather a lot of feedback. And open access journals are peer reviewed, but they do not require any sort of payment. Other questions with these modes of publication? Okay, for the remainder of this workshop, I want to be talking about what it means to uphold academic integrity, some things you can do if you're violating integrity, and how should the science community build its credibility, and how should scientific results be communicated to the general public. Academic integrity basically is some sort of community standard that will be observed by every researcher in the field. Simply, this means do not cheat. This kind of rejection towards cheating, it is exactly why scientific work can be believed by other researchers and even by people with little experience in the field. So by the general public. Academic integrity is both a moral and legal duty. So in the United States, we have something called the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, And what they will do is that they will distribute a lot of taxpayer money to research institutions and teams to power their research. So basically, the money you're using to do research came from the public. And therefore, if you perform some sort of fraud or dishonesty in your research, this is detrimental to the general public, and you will be prosecuted in certain cases. Academic integrity, it is also fundamental to the reputation of science and researchers. Generally, if a researcher has found to violate the integrity, you can almost guarantee that he or she will need to leave the entire field. From my university, we have something called the Research Integrity Policy. The first policy bans any sort of fabrication, so making up, falsification, or intentionally modifying, or plagiarism in proposing, reviewing, or reporting results. So this is essentially do not cheat. Secondly, we have, we want to prevent violations for research rules. One notorious case happened in Princeton University, where several years ago, a research team was accused of abusing their monkey subjects. They're playing with the monkey and then they're doing harmful things to them. So upholding this kind of research integrity is equally important. And this is considered as part of the academic integrity. And lastly, we're looking to prevent violation for the policy of authorship. So simply, this means that, because science is a collaborative project, it is very likely for a given research article to have several authors. But by listing their names as the authors, those people are committing to some sort of obligation, in that if there are any questions raised for their findings and for their paper, they have this responsibility to answer those questions. So authorship is something that is really, really important. It is an honor, but it's also a really important obligation. So what are some things you can do if you do not have integrity? And by all means, don't do this. Unfortunately, these three cases are all real world cases. So for example, the first one says, so I am a researcher. I heard this really great idea and some promising results from this famous researcher. And what I would do is that, because I want to be successful, I will simply do almost the same thing. So this case has recently been published in the news, where this researcher basically plagiarized or copied other people's thoughts and experiments. Of course, he was able to successfully do the experiment, but he didn't really cite the other researchers for proper credit. So this is a form of academic integrity violation. This is plagiarism. Secondly, there's a case, so I am a really good researcher, I'm a scientist, and I did some experiment for my son, and my son is entering this science competition. Why? Well, my son is listed as the only author and researcher, because I want him to win and because the competition doesn't allow for parental contribution. This ridiculous case has also recently been published, where this elementary school kid, he did some biological experiments, he did some PCR, he did some Western blot. So these are all kind of complicated cellular biology techniques. And he wrote up his results, and he found that there is this high expression of this gene in colorectal cancer cells. However, if you think this kid is some sort of child prodigy, well, he's not. So the news have found his research notebook, and I think, on the front page it says, today I learned about genes. I'm still kind of confused, what are genes? And on the second day, he was writing, I guess I kind of have some feelings for what genes are and such. So this clear mismatch in ability has garnered this case a lot of media attention. And this is a clear violation of authorship policy. You're listing someone who didn't really contribute a significant portion of the research as an author. And this is, just abuse of power and negligence towards responsibility. The last case is probably the most famous of these three. Basically, there was a researcher uh, uh, at Harvard University. He said he knew that damaged heart tissue cannot be regenerated. So this is some sort of scientific consensus that has been proposed by a lot of researchers. So this is true. But he thought, well, bummer. I will invent some cardiac stem cells so that I will be able to fix the heart, and became famous. So this kind of complete fraud was committed by former professor Piero Anversa. So this man, and basically what he did is that he invented this entire field that is completely false and made up. And he continued to publish in this made up idea for roughly 10 years or so. He became incredibly famous. There were a lot of followers, but then his research were found to be completely false. And as you can possibly imagine, this kind of violation is significantly more severe than other types because it is detrimental to other people's work. There may be other researchers who believed in his story and started to work to build on his findings that are false. So now their work will be ruined. There can also be, basically he's also giving false hope to patients. So overall, I just want to reiterate, do not commit any sort of violation of academic integrity. For the last part of this talk, I want to be, raising this growing argument about scientific credibility. So generally, science has been enjoying a lot of really good reputation as a source of reliable information about the world. This is largely dependent upon science's adherence to the scientific method. So as we saw, if we were to tackle a research question, we will need to do some sort of experiment. We will get some raw data, and then we will need to analyze our data using statistics, and then we'll need to interpret them reasonably. And we also saw that we have some sort of peer review mechanism where your work will be examined by other researchers. So there is really this intellectual environment that guarantees science really high credibility. However, in the recent years, there has been a lot of questioning to this credibility. If I type in scientific credibility in Google, you can see the general public is asking a lot of questions about whether those theories are simply believable. For example, psychosocial, behavioral theory, all of these theories have been really, really high profile in media, but they may not necessarily be true. There are several questions regarding the credibility of science, and these questions largely stem from the violation of academic integrity, from overgeneralization, and different opinions. There are many other ways, but I would just be introducing these three and try to introduce what it feels like to question the credibility of science. Okay, so okay. All right, thank you, Athena, for reminding me of the time. Okay, so I want to talk about the credibility of science. And the first type of credibility question is with academic integrity violation. And there is this really famous case. There is this physician. He was really, really famous because he published a paper where he found some connection between this vaccine for measles, mumps, and rubella. And he found, this vaccination had connection to the onset of autism. So basically, if you take this vaccine, you will be more likely to develop autistic behaviors. And as you can possibly imagine, this kind of almost scandal to medicine has ignited a lot of discussion. A lot of parents, especially in the UK, where this physician was from, they started something called the anti-vaccination movement, where they refused to give a vaccine to their kids. This movement has also came to the United States, and even to this day, you will meet a lot of people who said, "Oh, vaccines can cause autism, can cause this and that problems, and therefore we are refusing to give our kids this kind of vaccine." And this physician chose to popularize his research by something called science by press conference. So basically, he went out to have a press conference like some sort of celebrity. And he said, I can support the continued use of these three vaccines given in combination until this issue has been resolved. So what he's doing here, why is this problematic? Well, he not only published his results, but he's adding some sort of personal opinion on top of science. And because this personal opinion is very, very subjective, what he is doing is that he's trying to lead people into buying his personal opinion and diverging those people from reading the papers. And one very last problem, probably the biggest, is that he has some undisclosed conflict of interest. It was later found that this physician has received a lot of money from solicitors seeking evidence to use against vaccine manufacturers. So this is a case where money can buy scientific opinion, money can buy scientific discoveries, and this discovery has been especially notorious because after a lot of anti-vaccination movement, a lot of countries have been seeing a lot of recurrence of conditions such as measles, mumps, and rubella. And this is still a very hot, ongoing argument within the scientific world. So this is where some sort of academic integrity problem can trigger questioning into the science credibility. The second case really has to do with overgeneralization. So if you have ever taken psychology classes, you probably have heard about John B. Watson. So basically, he popularized this idea of behavioralism. He thought that conditioning or pairing some sort of behavior with a stimulus can be used to basically educate children and to manipulate child behavior. So the way he established this thought is through some sort of scientific research. So we have this little kid, little Albert. Basically, he presented little Albert with a rabbit that is very cute. So little Albert was like, oh, I like this rabbit. But then as he was presenting this rabbit, he made a really, really horrible sound. And over time, little Albert became very, very scared upon seeing the rabbit, even though there was no more sound. So basically, there was some sort of association of the rabbit and the horrible sound. However, Watson chose not only to publish this finding, but also to overgeneralize it and to say that, oh, this kind of thing can be used to treat any sort of education. We should all be looking into this paradigm. If you give me some infants, I can make them into whoever you want me to, simply by following this paradigm. And because this kind of statement is very, very bold and easy to understand, this was quickly bought by the general public. So around that time, there was a education movement about behaviorism. Basically, people thought parents, especially the mothers, should not show a lot of affection toward their kids. Instead, they need to mold their behavior using this kind of stimulus approach. However, if you look at the original experiments and the papers, you will see there were a lot of limitations. So this kind of overgeneralization is problematic because it is saying something the results are not. So this is a way that science can influence the public, and the public may deviate from the original scientific finding. One last thing I want to talk about is how political and popular opinions can drive science. So in the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen this drug coming out in the news. It's called hydroxychloroquine, or HCQ. Basically, we've seen a lot of statements as to HCQ can be beneficial for the treatment of COVID-19. However, if you simply read all of the scientific articles, you'll see there really isn't a lot of consensus between researchers. There are papers that are saying we didn't really find any association between HCQ and any change in the COVID-19 symptoms. So there was no effect. There are also papers that are showing HCQ did prove to have some effect, but the FDA was also saying, okay, so even if HCQ is beneficial, we're seeing some sort of really negative side effects. We're seeing heart problems. So overall, the scientific world is saying we need to be really cautious about HCQ. We are still working on studying it, and we do not recommend it without proper information. So we don't know what to do yet. However, in the political world, you're seeing a lot of powerful people just saying, I think we should start using HCQ without really solid scientific endorsement. However, these people, because they're really, really powerful, and what they say can leave a huge impact on what the public chooses to believe and do. So I just want to, introduce this kind of idea that sometimes the public can direct the science. I want to end up this workshop by doing some sort of recap and to really leave you with several questions. In this workshop, we first talk about several ways to report our research. We start with primary research article, which includes a very, very standardized way of reporting. We start with abstract to introduction, methods, results, discussion, and conclusion. We also talk about systematic reviews, where we combine individual papers together to get some sort of bigger picture understanding. There can also be letters, editorials, and book chapters where different research teams engage in a collective conversation. We also talk about scientific credibility. Science enjoys high reputation because people really follow this academic integrity, and there is this peer review mechanism. There are also preprints, which is a way to quickly introduce research. And we also talk about open access journals. And lastly, for the relationship between science and the public, we talk about several questions as to the credibility of science. There can be the conflict of interest problem, where money can inform what the scientist chooses to believe in, as we saw with the anti-vaccination movement. There can also be overgeneralization, as to sometimes, yes, there is a research being performed. However, the public is making more out of that research. We saw that with behaviorism and taken out of context. And lastly, we talk about beliefs and political opinions and how can they powerfully deviate the public from science. We saw that with hydroxychloroquine in COVID-19. So I want to end up this workshop with two major questions. How should science interact with the public? And what role should scientific credibility play for the general public? I hope that, as you embark to your amazing, amazing journeys in neuroscience and to other disciplines of science and become really influential, I hope you're still thinking about how science should interact with the public. As you're observing your academic integrity, as you're being really truthful to science, I also want you to think, how should we, as people working in science, disseminate our knowledge to the general public? And thank you so much for coming to this workshop. I will now open for questions. And if you do, you can go to this website, poev.com/ZLI188 to type in your questions. They will appear here, or you can just shout it out. We have roughly 4 minutes for questions. I will also be monitoring the chat, so you can also choose to type in your questions there. Okay. Right. So how did I become interested in science communication? Um, that is a really interesting question. So I actually, this is something that I learn about as I pick up in science. I think science communication, it is not really a standalone thing in science. So uh, there is study for research ethics. It is a field, but I think science communication is just something that all of the scientists and research staff, they really think about and follow. So I think my primary interest really uh, increased as I saw you know, a lot of interactions between science and the public during this pandemic. We're almost seeing some sort of scientific advancement on a daily basis, but we see the public using that science. We're not using that science. We're choosing to believe in part of that. So this is really a case where science and the public can interact. What's our scientific research? So the obesity and axonal integrity project, that was actually my research project. So I've been looking at how the brain structure is different for people with obesity. And we've been developing novel neuroimaging techniques to better measure some of those changes, such as neuroinflammation. And yes, we are seeing some sort of results. Inflammation has been observed in certain brain regions for people with obesity. Reliable sources, guys. Yes, so I will always say that the reliable source would be the primary source. So always go to the original paper to read through their findings and their limitations. What is their method, and what can you say for their results? There are other reliable sources. You can choose to see the news. There are websites such as Psychology Today, Neuroscience News, where they have science reporting staff to break down research articles to more comprehensible language.